Newsfirst, NEWSLINE with Faraz Shauketaly.
Well, good evening and a very warm welcome to NEWSLINE Zoom. And it is on Zoom or by Zoom because of the rising numbers of the COVID-19 figures and also the rising numbers, unfortunately, of the death numbers. And so Newsfirst, like everybody else, is doing their bit to try and ensure that the possibility of the spreading of COVID-19, this dreaded disease, is limited as much as possible. Now, this evening, my guest is Mr. Harshan Ananiakara, attorney at law, a member of the National People's Power Coalition, and of course, he's right here joining us by Zoom. Very good evening to you, Mr. Ananiakara.
Good evening, Faraz, and good evening to all your viewers.
Thank you. Now then, I'd like to ask you, in terms of, we read in the press, we see it on television and hear it on radio and so on, about hoarding and panic shopping and panic buying and so on. So, and then of course we had this state of emergency in a way declared by the president in terms of the essential goods. Now, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Ananiakara, in your opinion as a lawyer and also, of course, in your opinion as citizen Sri Lanka, is there a state of emergency?
Well, there is a form of emergency that has not arisen out of natural causes, but by sheer mismanagement of the COVID pandemic and related issues. So that's the reason the government is now claiming that there's a state of public emergency. Now, according to law, when the president declares emergency under the relevant provisions of the Public Security Ordinance, we can't even challenge the non-existence of a public emergency. It's a decision of the president.
Right, but then what about these instances of traders hoarding goods and not releasing it to the public for sale?
Right, now this is very important. So please let me explain this answer. The government and the allies always try to show, they're trying to show that these emergency regulations were invoked with the best interest of the consumer in mind, to prevent hoarding, to fix off maximum prices, to raid unlawful hoarding. But the reality is, even you look at the gazettes have been published under the Consumer Affairs Authority Act, because the Consumer Affairs Authority Act, which empowers fixing of prices, acting against hoarding, and all those things. Even the current raids on these sugar, warehouses were done under the authority of the Consumer Affairs Protection Authority Act, not under the emergency laws. Even when he made some of these services such as ports and petroleum and provincial authorities, essential services, that was also done under, according to the Gazette, that was done under the, the Services Act, Essential Services Act of 1979. So you could see there are enough laws in place without invoking the emergency regulations that they could have attended to this problem. And indeed, they are attending to it under those laws. So this public security ordinance shouldn't have been invoked at all, because that actually gives very wide powers, or rather a blank check to the president with some draconian powers to overrule almost any law of the land except for the constitution, which is a great threat to the rule of law and democracy.
So, so your take on it is that instead of declaring or instead of relying on the Consumer Affairs Authority Act to control these matters of hoarding and unlawful hoarding and so on, the president has gone for this state of emergency because of a collateral purpose?
That is my purpose. That is my point. See, already, even after amending, implying this, there's a state of emergency, which I doubt very much, but that is the decision of the president. He has not used those powers for the purposes that I told you before. He has used the Consumer Affairs Authority Act as well as Essential Services Act of 1979. But the purpose is this. Purpose, he has not even utilized it yet. Because remember, when you have these powers of emergency, you can amend almost any law in this country, as I told. You can arrest and detain people. You can make regulations to enter premises and search. You can even set up different courts which are not courts martial. So basically, through these emergency regulations, you can override the will of the parliament and run the show the way he wants. I believe the reason for this is this. Now, as you can see, the people are frustrated. They are very disappointed with the government. Cost of living is rising. Rule of law is deteriorating. There are so many protests around. Goods prices are going sky high. Now, when the country is open, there's a good possibility that people will resort to trade union actions. People will take it onto the streets. So they are worried that the unhappy people will take it onto the streets. And this is why what they have done is they have loaded the gun and kept it now, so to speak, in a figure of speech. Although this time around, he did not use the gun. It is loaded only, figure of speech, of course, right? So under this, he can have all those powers, and this will be utilized to suppress the voice of democratic dissent in time to come. And these emergency rules are actually a violation of rule of law and very, very dictatorial.
Aren't you speculating on the purpose of the president declaring an emergency and having a loaded gun? Isn't that speculation? Could it not be articulated that the president needs these rules to ensure that unscrupulous elements are not causing the republic any more hardship than they already have?
Well, basically, that will be their argument too. Then, if they have enacted these emergency regulations, but even for this hoarding issue, as I told you, the sugar issue or the essential food issue, they did not use the emergency regulations. They didn't. They used the Consumer Affairs Authority Act laws and the Essential Services Act. So, what could be the purpose him wanting to keep, as a figure of speech, I say, the loaded gun, if you're just going to not use it? And for what purpose can he use it? Now, we have to understand, he is calling this a public emergency. Now we know that corona is killing at least 200 people a day. There's a pandemic, an epidemic going on here. Now, he has not invoked the provisions of the Disaster Management Act.
That was going to be, yes, that was going to be my question. Why is the declaration of a state of disaster important?
Yes, it's very important because the Disaster Management Act of 2005 has a mechanism how to handle a disaster to benefit the people. Now, in that section 11, they are supposed to have a council comprising of the president, the prime minister, the opposition leader, and leading important ministries and some members of opposition. The idea is that in a case of a disaster, whether it be a tsunami, whether it be the flood or anything, or in fact, a disaster in the sea like the ship burning, the whole idea is that means the entire parliament will get together at one team to solve the national crisis. No, there's no political bickering. You're one unit. And in fact, the interpretation section of the Disaster Management Act specifically includes epidemic, specifically includes a national disaster to be epidemic. But still, he's not declaring it. The reason for it, again, you can allege that I'm speculating, is Section 17 of the Disaster Management Act. Now, according to Section 17, once you establish the council, all donations, all loans, gifts, whatever you get to combat the COVID pandemic or epidemic has to be coming to the central fund maintained by the council. That means there's accountability, how the money is spent, for what is the money spent. Right now, it's under the COVID task force, which is under Mr. Basil Rajapaksa. Now, as you know, these task force are outside ministries and they are not accountable to the parliament. In that sense, they are not legally recognized entities, right? So therefore, that's why there are so many speculations and allegations about antigen test kits being purchased or quarantine centers, because those expenditures, people are questioning why there's no transparency. The parliament doesn't know how this money is being spent. It's not being audited. So if the Disaster Management Act is activated, then the government has to be accountable for all the monies that is received to the fund. It's my speculation. It's my thinking. The only reason when there's such a big disaster going on, when the law clearly provides for the joint mechanism, because President is the chairman of that such thing. Prime Minister is also there. So he could easily establish one. It's not like that means you fight collectively together as a nation, but they're not doing it. The reason is they don't want to be accountable to the funds received. This is the only thing I can think of under the Disaster Management Act.
This is what you can think about. This is what you can speculate on.
Of course, I'm speculating because is there any other valid reason for not activating the Disaster Management Act? Is there any valid reason to activate the Public Securities Ordinance and use other acts to combat the problem? Because the people believe it is through these emergency regulations their food security has been established. Wrong. It is done by the Consumer Affairs Protection Authority. So this Public Security Ordinance is actually, he's keeping it as a bit of a, as I told you, a loaded gun.
Harshana Nayakara, what is the essential difference between declaring a state of emergency and declaring a state of disaster?
Now, good question. We should direct this to the president because he's the one who has decided there's a public emergency, right? But what is a state of disaster is defined in the law, Disaster Management Act, right? In the interpretation section, it says it could be flooding, yada, 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 health, whatever. So we know what is a disaster because it's defined in the law. But what is a public emergency is up to mainly common sense as well as the decision of the president. My argument is this: if the government or the president is not declaring Corona a disaster, then how can, on the same tone, they can turn around and say Corona is a public emergency? How can they say that? It doesn't make sense. And the worst part is, because of Section 3 of the Public Securities Ordinance, we can't even challenge the president's powers to make emergency regulations when he invokes the existence of a public emergency, for which he is not accountable to anyone.
And your contention is that there is no need to declare a state of emergency, that there are enough rules and regulations contained within the Consumer Affairs Authority Act
and the Essential Services Act to combat this particular problem of hoarding and price fixing. For that, you don't need public security ordinance laws. In fact, the government didn't even use them. Even now, they are using those laws, not the public security ordinance.
And how does the government control or force traders to push their stocks into the market when they might actually be losing in rupee terms?
Now, this is the biggest problem. Now, if you remember, sugar was brought into this country on a very small tax, right? So therefore, I think markets are having a problem because the dollar is very wavering and it's like, increasing every day. So for that, you need to have an open discussion with the traders and this publishing of gazettes, right? Because if they made a huge amount of money, because remember, most of this sugar was brought into this country and sold at 120 with just a 25 rupee tax. Thereafter, they started selling it at 220. And now the government is publishing a gazette saying, please sell it at 130 rupees. In fact, the government is allowing that those sugar which came down to this country landed here for 85 rupees a kilo, right? Even if you put 15 rupees or 20 rupees for their profit and logistics, still sugar can be sold at 110 or 115. But while you can do that, the government is saying, sell it at 130. So, I mean, is this government there to protect businessmen or to protect the consumers? What are they up to?
But if we calculate the replacement cost of the sugar, as in the next bit of imports, isn't this anomaly in the prices? Can we blame it at the doorstep of the foreign exchange rate, the dollar to the rupee rate?
No, basically, whatever the dollar rate in the international market, we have to pay. But especially during the sugar situation and the sugar scam we had that was about making a thumping massive profit at the cost of the government coffers of 15.2 billion in tax income, right? So If it is 25 cents, they brought the kilo in. They can sell it 110 or 150. But in the future, if the sugar prices are up in the market, dollar has gone down, then for that consignment, you may have to increase the price. Otherwise, the businessman will suffer. But remember, these law-abiding, good, decent, honest businessmen are suffering anyway because of a few connected businesses or people with connections to the government and unethical practices are ruling the market by manipulating it.
And on that note, we'll go for a short break and take a peek at this evening's headlines from the News First Primetime News team. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
Newsfirst, NEWSLINE with Faraz Shauketaly. Newsfirst, NEWSLINE with Faraz Shauketaly.
And welcome back to Newsline Zoom. I'm in conversation with Mr. Harshana Nanayakkara, attorney at law and also representing the political party known as the NPP, of which the JVC is a component member. Now then, Mr. Nanayakkara, I hear what you say about the differences between the state of declaring a state of disaster and declaring a state of emergency. But actually speaking, either of these methods, either the disaster declaration or the emergency declaration, won't they both help the people?
Well, it depends on what the government's real intentions are, right? Now, first and foremost, while I believe Corona was natural, and for that, this government I will not blame. But from the word go, from the initial drive of vaccinations, antigen test kits, quarantines, people are frustrated because they feel they are mismanaging the entire set of affairs. So if there's an emergency now, a public emergency, which I don't believe, is there a disaster? Yes, because we must have that disaster mechanism because we are experiencing a disaster. So we have the president who has not declared a disaster, but calling it a public emergency. If it is serving the people, by all means, go ahead. Who says no to it? Remember, the butter knife can be used to apply butter on your piece of bread. And also the butter knife could be used to stab someone, to hurt someone. So it all depends on the intentions in whose hands the butter knife is. Now, I do not know what the government want to do, but at this juncture, opening up the PSO or the Public Securities Ordinance, they have a bigger plan. They have a bigger plan. That is to silence the democratic voice of dissent, the right to protest. All those things will be targeted in time to come. Even now it's happening. Whoever makes an opinion or a press conference against the opinion of the government, they get dragged to the CID for questioning. They just question. It's either harassment or try to instill fear. Government is in trouble. They are using these laws to safeguard themselves and not to serve the public. That's my take.
But surely we could do without these protests and so on, because they are being held within the currency of this global pandemic. And we are telling people to keep your distance and so on and so forth. But if people gather to protest and so on, surely it doesn't help the fellow citizen.
Well, frankly, the protests were held at times when the country was open. Protests were held when the government sent a letter asking all government servants to report to work. Protests were held at a time spas were open. Spas were open. Are you telling me a spa is something that you can do with 1 meter distance? Very unlikely. Look at the buses and the trains, how people went to. Did they follow quarantine regulations? Did they manage to keep the distance? Is it possible? Is it practical? So even the protesters exercised their democratic rights when the country was not under lockdown, using health regulations and keeping their distance. But if you look at public trains and buses, how people went to work, I mean, that should have been stopped. There was no distance there. So I think on the one side, protesting is the right of the people. And if we keep quiet, I mean, the government would love the idea that everybody stays quiet till the end of the epidemic or the pandemic. Why? They can pass their laws, they can alienate land, they can do whatever they want, and people have to just stay inside the houses. I'm sure the government would love that. Any government would love that. But what I'm saying is, when the problem is now, the protest has to be done now. Yes, we have to follow health rules and regulations. All those protests were done at a time when the country was open for business. So I find nothing wrong with those protests as long as they were carried out with honest intentions following health regulations.
And Mr. Nanakar, can I ask you this, just to move on a little bit onto another bone of contention, which is the finance bill. Why do you find this finance bill so contentious? Is it because you are representing an opposition party? Is it mere political chicanery?
Faraz, I'm an honest citizen and I do pay my taxes. And I don't want, because I've been an honest citizen, right, earning my honest living and paying government dues. I don't want people who avoided taxes, using corrupt practices, earn black money, to be rewarded instead of me. That is what this act does. If I may explain to you a little, what this act does is that anyone who has not declared any of the assets they had prior to this, they can declare so all their income, whatever it is, for just by paying a nominal tax of 1%. That means if you are assessed for 100 as tax, you can pay 1%. So in fact, who will have this amount of undisclosed money? It can't be the farmers, it can't be the average, honest, decent businessman, or the citizen, or the fisher folk, or the government servants. Well, at least the majority of them. These are monies ordered by big businessmen who have connections with various government members or politicians themselves. Some time ago, you remember the speculations was rife that many politicians have taken money out of this country and deposited in Dubai or Singapore accounts. In fact, there was a story about opening up a consular place in Seychelles, where Shiranti Rajapaksa's brother was the ambassador. So all those things. So now we are allowing. Now, who will have this kind of money? Those who sell drugs will have that kind of money. Those who are engaged in corrupt practices will have that money. Those who, who take ransom, the underworld have that kind of money. So that kind of ill-gotten gains, the government is passing a bill saying, please do come with them, we will whitewash them for you. So what is the plight of me, the decent, honest citizen, who've been paying taxes all this time?
But there's no...
I'm the one who's been penalized.
But there's no let-up for the people who actually paid the taxes and at the whatever the right rate is, and between this this suggestion that people can bring their money in and pay 1% and no questions asked.
Exactly. So the government is actually getting on with the official in money laundering business. They are legalizing money laundering. Remember, there are international commitments we have. There are a lot of international conventions against money laundering, right? And the UNHCR is looking at us. The European Parliament on Human Rights looking at us about all these presidential pardons and the rule of law and democracy. And now the government is sponsoring a bill which will allow all ill-gotten gains of people. Now just imagine a businessman who has been paying taxes and a man who has evaded all the taxes, right? So the decent, honest businessman will not be able to sell his products or services at the same price as those guys who avoided and evaded taxes. So it is the honest, decent citizen and the businessman who's going to suffer. The government is looking after, or rather rewarding, a few, people with ill-gotten gains. If you ask me, can't be even more than 200 people in the entire country to have that amount of money and disclose assets. So I think we are really putting off the honest citizen from paying taxes in the future. So it is unfair, it is wrong, and frankly, we might internationally, we will look very bad, and the government that is going to come after this one will have to deal with all the repercussions.
Harshna Nanakar, tell me please, is there a fairer method in trying to attract these monies that are obviously beyond the reach of our treasury and our inland revenue and so on? Is there an alternative rather than only dangle this 1% duty tax carrot?
Right. Let me also tell this way. Now, Part 2 of this act has another aspect to it. That is, even indirect taxes, which you're supposed to pay, like the nation building tax or something like that, even that could be waived under Part 2 if you disclose them, voluntary disclosure, right? So what I'm saying is, if the government is saying we are not having enough money to increase the salary of teachers, we do not have enough money for that, we do not have enough money for that. Now, getting 1% won't help. No, you can do two things. One, fine, we will not take criminal action against you for money laundering or anything, but declare the full things and pay the full tax. In that way, at least the government will get more money than just 1%, or at least pay 50% of the due tax. Why just 1% nominal tax? What is the reason for it? Because we cannot allow. So it's more than a matter of finances. It's more about how a citizen will feel. An honest citizen will feel who has even had to close down some other businesses due to tax issues. Now he suddenly sees these guys are getting it. So what I'm saying is, yes, if you're honest about wanting the money, then why 1%? Charge 50%. Or say, pay the full amount, but we will not prosecute you. Shouldn't that be good encouragement for honest people? That is what we're suggesting. Remember, whatever I am saying for us, it is not because I represent a particular political party. I am a citizen of this country who pay taxes. I have a right to say this.
And what do you say to the people who are evading taxes? Would you readily call them traitors?
There are two things. One is avoiding taxes. The other one is evasion of taxes. Now, avoiding of taxes is not an offense. You can have various ways of running a business to avoid taxes. Okay. But once you are assessed, if you evade a tax, that means you are committing an offense. But if you look at a country like developed countries like Denmark or Sweden, their tax levels are very high. But people do pay those taxes very willingly and voluntarily. Why? They have a good public service, health, education, transport. The public in this country feels whatever the taxes we pay, we don't have health benefits, we don't have any proper transport, we don't have a good common life because tax monies have not been used on the people. So people feel it is pointless paying taxes, so they try to evade. That is the majority of them. But yes, to call them traitors, I mean, not paying taxes, I wouldn't call it that far, but those who have funneled the income of the treasury and public purse, who have drained the public purse to benefit them, yeah, they are traitors. In fact, some of them are even in the parliament, I think.
And today earlier they were debating this thing. We are of course recording it before they finished. Tell me, we have the 20th Amendment, we have this declaration of the state of emergency, and in my very simple outlook, I say to you, why do we need the Parliament? If all this power is with one person, then why do we need the Parliament? Let's shut it down.
Well, actually, this will be like music to the ears of the president, I think, because the way he has been amassing power, the 20th Amendment, as you rightly pointed it, made Parliament a simple rubber stamp, okay? And then 2/3 majority. The Prime Minister, you have so many Rajapaksas in the cabinet running government portfolios. So this entire country is run by a family and their friends. So one would wonder why the Parliament is necessary. But I think the Parliament is necessary to keep the hopes of average decent citizens alive. The hope that we will not go back to the tribal ages where the tribal leader leads us. Instead, we will have a democracy. So we keep the Parliament alive simply because we can fill it up with decent, honest people, at least at the next election. Because whatever we are experiencing is not fault of the Parliament as an institution. That is the place where they are supposed to look at the public financing, whether our monies are being spent properly. None of these corrupt politicians are inside the Parliament by breaking the gates of the Parliament and entering, simply because we voted them in. So I think on the one side thinking, yeah, Parliament is useless. On the other hand, for the future's sake, for the hope of democracy and rule of law and separation of powers, I think we somehow have to keep it alive and given a half a chance to this government. If they could pass a law to ban the Parliament, I'm sure they will. But fortunately, even under the emergency regulations, they can't override the Constitution. That's the only safeguard we have.
Does that make you sad as a Sri Lankan?
What do you mean, the emergency regulations?
Well, yes. The regulations, the emergency regulations, you say that we don't really need them because we've got existing laws to deal with these matters, like the Consumer Affairs Authority Act and so on and so forth. So when you see this accumulation of power, centered on the one institution, does that make you sad?
Very sad indeed, because our constitution, based on separation of powers, to act as checks and balances for the best interest of the citizenry. But from the time this government came, they kept on amassing power through the 2/3, appointing their friends and family for posts, appointing the prime minister as a brother prime minister. So everything is a mess. So basically, we are kind of going back to the tribal chief leading. So sooner or later, people will start feeling that this system is really very, very tribalistic. So I feel very sad after thousands of years of human evolution and coming forward with democracy and rule of law with proper values, we have been dragged to the stone ages just because there's one individual who's mad over amassing power. He doesn't realize, no matter how much power that person has, if you're not capable of performing a job, you are a failure. You are a failed person. No amount of power or law can help a person who cannot perform a job. The best acceptance of the fact that the president has failed is the arrival of Mr. Basil Rajapaksa. We remember how the government themselves celebrated with Ratinya and Kiribat. By the way, during lockdown, that time they did that, right? All around saying the man with 7 brains, like the Ravana. So all that praising and arrival of Basil explains that the government unofficially and indirectly accepts that the Gotabaya Rajapaksa is not capable of delivering. The country's problem is that people had so much of expectations. The government became increasingly unpopular because they were unable to deliver on the hopes of the people, and they're going back on the promises they made in Saubhagya Dakma. And president somehow feels if he amass power by emergency regulations or various other means, he could stay safe and the government would be safe. To serve public, you don't need this amount of laws because leaders are supposed to lead. A democratic leader is supposed to lead with discussions, negotiations, and consensus with people, not by laws, not by the sword. And those leaders don't last that long. History has shown that to us.
Splendid. Thank you very much, Harshan Ananyakara, for spending your evening with our Newsline Zoom team. Thank you. We, as always, appreciate your concerns on behalf of the Republic, and we hope that the powers that be will actually be listening and take note of this alternative viewpoint, which I'm sure will not upset or rock the boat too much. Because after all, it is somebody's right to say what they think it should be done or not. On that note, thank you very much for watching Newsline Zoom. Take care, and as always, God bless you.
Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shauketaly.